Is this a joke or something? The young officer's voice, sharp and full of pride that only comes from a new rank, rang out strangely in the huge, cool space of the drone storage building. He stood with his hands on his waist, his uniform so fresh it still had fold marks from the package. He stared at the elderly man in front of him, a man who looked small inside his red janitor uniform. "Do you even know where you're standing, old man?" Henry Walker, 82 years old, didn't reply. He just leaned against his rolling garbage can. His rough, aged hands rested on the plastic edge. His eyes, the color of a pale sky, weren't looking at the young officer. Instead, they focused on the smooth, dangerous attack drone sitting quietly in the middle of the building. He'd seen machines like this before, though they had been rougher, noisier, and flown by young men with scared eyes. This one was different. It was like a ghost, a quiet killer, and he knew what it was made for with a clearness that would have scared the young officer. The young officer looked at the two airmen standing beside him with a tired expression. Their faces showed discomfort and trained calmness. They were just doing what they were told. "Show me your ID," the officer snapped, losing patience. "And move away from the equipment, right now." His voice cracked like a whip meant to shock and control. He took a small step forward, his hand moving down to rest carelessly, almost like a show on his gun holder. It was a move meant purely to scare, a silly show of power in a place filled with more deadly weapons than 10 armies. Henry's eyes slowly moved from the drone, past the worried airman, and finally landed on the young officer. He didn't jump. He didn't say anything. He just watched, his stillness completely different from the officer's anxious energy. The officer's face got tight, his jaw clenching. He saw a weak, confused janitor who had walked into a restricted space, a problem that needed to be handled quickly and rudely. He couldn't see the many years of training shown in the old man's posture, training so deep that it had become a quiet way of being. He couldn't understand the calmness in Henry's eyes, thinking it was the empty look of memory loss instead of the patient watching of a man who had faced dangers far bigger than a young man in a clean uniform. "Can't you hear me?" the officer pushed, his voice getting louder. "I'm putting you under arrest for entering a secure area. You will follow my orders. Put your hands where I can see them." The airmen moved uncomfortably, their worry growing. They had seen Henry cleaning these floors for years, a constant presence as reliable as morning light. He was just the janitor, a quiet, simple figure who kept to himself and did his work with slow, careful attention. This felt wrong. The officer, however, kept going, trapped in the pull of his own authority. "I said, put your hands where I can see them," he said again, taking another step forward, his voice now a full shout that spread across the smooth concrete floor. The problem had started with a simple, forgotten tool bag. Henry had been finishing his night cleaning when he noticed it. A standard repair kit left dangerously close to the air intake of the MQ-9 Reaper drone. He knew what foreign objects could do to a turbine engine. Without thinking twice, he had walked over, his old work boots making soft, regular sounds on the floor. He bent down with a small grunt, picked up the bag, and was turning to put it on a work table when the officer, a new person transferred to the base's security team, had come around the back of the drone. He didn't see a hard-working employee stopping a possible disaster. He saw an unauthorized civilian touching military equipment. From there, things got worse. The officer's questions were accusations from the beginning. "Who are you? What are you doing here? What's your security level?" Henry had tried to explain in his quiet, rough voice, but the officer wasn't interested in explanations. He was interested in showing his power. He had grabbed Henry's simple plastic ID card from his uniform, laughing at the title, "Contract Cleaning." It was a job so low in his eyes that it only made him more suspicious. How could a man like this have access to one of the most advanced pieces of military technology on the planet? Now a small group was starting to gather at a respectful distance. A few mechanics and electronics experts, drawn by the officers yelling, watched with worried faces. They knew Henry. They knew his quiet nods, the way he'd sometimes stop to look at the drones with an expression nobody could read, the faint, almost invisible smell of cleaning chemicals and old coffee that followed him. He was part of the building's daily life, a silent figure who cleaned up their messes without complaining. The officer, encouraged by the audience, puffed out his chest. He was making an example of this old man, showing his own alertness and dedication to security. "You see this badge?" the officer said, his voice dripping with mockery. He pointed a finger toward a small, worn metal object pinned to the collar of Henry's uniform. It was a simple design, barely visible against the faded red fabric. "What's this supposed to be? Some souvenir you bought at a museum? A little toy to make you feel important?" He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "This is a military base, Grandpa. We deal with real honors here, not cheap junk." He was enjoying himself now, the embarrassment of the old man feeding his own insecurities. He was building his case, creating a story of a confused old fool who needed to be removed. He waved to one of the airmen. "Get ready to take him to the security office. We're going to run a full background check. I want to know everything about this man." The airman hesitated for just a moment, his eyes meeting Henry's before a sharp, "Now, airman," from the officer pushed him into reluctant action. The circle was closing in, the weight of the young officer's authority pressing down on the quiet old man. As the officer's finger touched the worn badge on Henry's collar, the world for Henry flickered for just a second. The bright, clean light of the building faded into a burning, dusty sun. The low hum of the drone's electronics was replaced by the loud rotor noise of a Huey helicopter struggling to take off from a damaged landing area. The sharp smell of ozone and jet fuel disappeared, replaced by the metallic smell of blood and the thick, choking dust of a place he hadn't let himself remember in years. He saw a hand, young and steady, pinning that same piece of metal to his own sweat-soaked, dirt-covered uniform. He heard a voice, rough and full of respect, spoken by a commander he had looked up to. "You don't just get one of these," the commander had said, his words nearly lost in the noise. "You earn it with blood. Don't ever forget what it cost." The memory was like a lightning strike, a flash of fire and thunder that lasted no longer than a heartbeat before the building became solid around him once more. The officer was still talking, his face twisted in a sneer, completely unaware of the war hero he was trying to break. Henry's expression didn't change, but deep in his faded blue eyes, a distant fire had been lit again. Across the building, leaning against a huge yellow toolbox, stood Master Sergeant Davis. He was a man who had seen more than his share of proud young officers. He was also a man who understood the complex, often invisible rankings of a military base. Rankings that had nothing to do with the rank on someone's collar. He had been watching the scene with a growing sense of fear. He had always made a point to greet Henry in the mornings, to ask him how he was doing. There was something about the old janitor, a deep stillness that Davis recognized. It was the same stillness he'd seen in a handful of special operators during his own time in the Special Forces, a calmness that came from having walked through hell and survived. The officer's public embarrassment of the old man was a violation of some unspoken rule. It was a deep and serious act of disrespect that set all of Davis's finely tuned instincts on alert. When the officer put his hand near Henry's collar, mocking the badge, Davis had seen enough. He knew that some things, some symbols, were sacred. Pushing himself off the toolbox, he moved with quiet urgency, slipping into the shadows at the edge of the building. He pulled out his personal cell phone, his thumb flying across the screen. He bypassed the chain of command, the squadron leaders, and the operations officers. He had the personal number of the base commander, Colonel Richardson, a privilege reserved for very few people. He knew it was a risk, a serious break of protocol to call the commander directly over something that on the surface seemed like a small security issue. But his gut, something he had learned to trust completely over 25 years of service, was screaming at him that this was no small issue. The phone rang once, twice. Colonel Richardson answered, his voice impatient. "This better be important, Master Sergeant." Davis took a breath, his voice low and steady, making sure no one could hear. "Sir," he said, "you need to get down to Building 4, right now." There was a pause. "What is it, Davis?" "It's Lieutenant Harris, sir. He's arresting one of the contract janitors." "A janitor?" The colonel's voice was thick with annoyance. "And you're calling my personal cell for that?" "Sir," Davis said, choosing his next words carefully, "the janitor's name is Henry Walker." Colonel Richardson was in his office, a large room with walls decorated with awards and photographs of him with serious-faced generals, when Master Sergeant Davis's call came in. He had been in the middle of reviewing supply reports, his mind full of fuel orders and flight schedules. The name Henry Walker cut through the noise like a sniper's bullet. For a moment, the colonel said nothing. The name echoed in the silence of his office, a name he hadn't heard spoken out loud in over 10 years. A name that was the stuff of whispered legends and classified mission reports, read only by those with the highest security clearances. "Say that name again, Master Sergeant," Richardson commanded, his voice suddenly stripped of all its earlier annoyance. He was already on his feet, his chair pushed back so hard it scraped against the polished floor. "Walker, sir. Henry Walker," Davis repeated. "He's an elderly man, sir. Works as a janitor here." The colonel felt a cold dread wash over him. He walked to his desk, his eyes scanning a row of secure direct-line phones. This was a complete failure. How had a man like Henry Walker been allowed to work in quiet anonymity, mopping floors? How had his own command been so blind? "Keep him there, Davis," the colonel ordered, his voice now a low, urgent growl. "Do not, under any circumstances, let that officer take him anywhere. Am I clear?" "Crystal, sir," Davis replied. The line went dead. Colonel Richardson slammed the phone down and yelled for his assistant. "Get my car and get the honor guard. Full dress uniform. Now move!" The assistant, a young captain, stared, confused by the sudden explosion of activity. He had never seen the colonel like this. It was as if the base had just gone to its highest alert level. "Sir, what's the occasion?" he stammered. The colonel was already putting on his service jacket, his face a mask of serious determination. "The occasion, Captain," he said, his voice tight with a mixture of anger and amazement, "is that we have a living legend in our building, and we've been letting him clean our bathrooms." Back in the building, the officer's arrogance had reached its peak. He was completely unaware of the storm that was about to crash over his head. Henry's silence, his refusal to be provoked or scared, had only made him angrier. He saw it as disrespect, a silent rebellion that needed to be crushed. "That's it. I'm done with this," he declared, pulling a pair of zip-tie handcuffs from his belt. "You're being arrested as a possible security threat. Your refusal to cooperate will be noted in my report." He gestured again to the airman. "Take him. If he fights back, use necessary force." The airman exchanged another nervous look. Use force on an 82-year-old janitor? The order was ridiculous, but it was a direct order. One of them took a hesitant step toward Henry. The officer smirked, a cruel, victorious look on his face. He was in control. He was the authority. He was about to make a clear statement about the importance of security rules on his base. He was going to put this old man in his place, and in doing so, raise his own status in the eyes of his superiors. He had no idea that he wasn't just ending his career. He was about to become a famous footnote in the history of the base, a warning story told to new officers for generations to come about the dangers of pride and the hidden courage of simple men. Just as the airman reached out a reluctant hand toward Henry's arm, a deep, powerful rumble filled the air. It wasn't the sound of a jet engine. It was the sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed. The massive bay doors of the building, which had been closed, began to slide open with a loud metal groan, flooding the huge space with the bright afternoon sun. Outlined against the light was a convoy of black official vehicles led by the base commander's staff car, its flags waving. They screeched to a stop on the pavement just outside the building, doors flying open before the wheels had even stopped turning. Colonel Richardson stepped out of the lead car, his face like a thunderstorm. He was followed by the base command chief master sergeant and a full 14-man honor guard, their dress blues perfect, their white gloves bright against the gray concrete. The sight was so unexpected, so overwhelmingly official, that it stunned the entire building into silence. The mechanics and specialists froze, their tools hanging forgotten in their hands. The officer and his two airmen stood as if turned to stone, their petty drama instantly made meaningless by the arrival of the base's entire command structure. This wasn't a response. It was a display of overwhelming force, a show of honor and authority that the building, a simple workshop for war machines, had never witnessed before. Colonel Richardson walked into the building, his footsteps echoing like hammer strikes in the sudden complete silence. His eyes, burning with cold fire, swept past the staring onlookers and the terrified officer as if they weren't even there. He walked directly to the old man in the red uniform. He stopped exactly 3 feet in front of him, his posture perfectly straight. For a moment, he simply looked at Henry, his expression a complex mix of disbelief, respect, and deep regret. Then an emotion so sharp and precise it seemed to cut the air, Colonel Richardson snapped to the stiffest position of attention and gave a salute. It wasn't a casual greeting. It was a salute of deep, almost worshipful respect, the kind a soldier gives to a head of state or a Medal of Honor recipient. "Mr. Walker," the colonel's voice boomed, filled with an emotion that no one present had ever heard from him before. "It is an honor, sir." The officer's jaw dropped. The airman's eyes were as wide as plates. The colonel turned his head slightly, his gaze now falling on the gathered personnel. "For those of you who don't know," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the building, "you are in the presence of Chief Master Sergeant Henry Walker, retired. He is one of the founding members of the Air Force's Pararescue Service. He was a pioneer in combat search and rescue. During his 26 years of service, he completed over 100 combat rescue missions from the jungles of Vietnam to the mountains of Afghanistan." The colonel paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. He then looked directly at the officer, his eyes narrowing. "That cheap junk on his collar, Lieutenant, is the Air Force Cross, our nation's second highest award for bravery in combat. He was awarded it for actions during the Santa Raid, a mission so secret most of you have never even heard of it." The crowd of onlookers gasped. They weren't just looking at a janitor anymore. They were looking at a hero, a living piece of history who had been walking silently among them all along. The colonel turned his full, undivided attention to the officer. The young man seemed to shrink under the weight of the commander's stare, his face having gone from a confident smirk to a mask of pale, sickly fear. "Lieutenant Harris," the colonel began, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that was somehow more terrifying than his earlier shouting. "You stand here in a building that houses the peak of modern air power, and you fail to recognize the man who wrote the book on rescuing pilots from behind enemy lines. You, who have never heard a shot fired in anger, chose to publicly embarrass a man who has more courage in his little finger than you have in your entire body." The officer opened his mouth to speak, to stammer out an excuse, but the colonel cut him off. "You are an embarrassment to that uniform, to your rank, and to every man and woman serving on this base. Your disrespect is a stain on my command." The words were like physical hits. The officer wilted, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a frightened, ashamed young man. Just as the colonel seemed ready to deliver a final career-ending blow, a quiet voice cut through the tension. "That's enough, Colonel." All eyes turned to Henry. He had straightened up slightly, his hands no longer leaning on the trash can. He looked at the colonel, then at the humiliated officer. "The boy made a mistake," Henry said, his voice calm and even. "He was trying to do his job. He was just a little too proud about it." He then looked directly at Lieutenant Harris, his faded eyes holding not anger, but a quiet, deep wisdom. "Son," he said gently, "the most important thing you can wear with that uniform isn't the rank on your shoulder, it's humility. Remember that." The simple words, delivered with grace instead of anger, landed with more force than any punishment. As Henry spoke, the image of the small, worn badge flashed once more in his mind. This time the memory was clearer. He was on his knees in the mud, the chaos of a failed rescue mission raging around him. A young pilot, his legs broken, was bleeding badly. Enemy fire was hitting their position. Henry had shielded the pilot with his own body, while his hands, sure and steady, worked to stop the bleeding. It was then that his commander, Major Cooper, had been shot. In his dying moments, Cooper had pulled the badge from his own collar. "You're the bravest man I've ever known, Henry," he had gasped, pressing the badge into his hand. "Wear it for all the boys we couldn't bring home." It wasn't an official award. It was something more. It was a battlefield gift of courage, a transfer of honor from a dying man to the one who fought to save him. The official Air Force Cross had come later in a quiet ceremony. But this badge, the one the officer had mocked, was the one that truly mattered. It was a reminder not of glory, but of cost. The fallout from the incident in Building 4 was quick and final. Lieutenant Harris was formally punished and immediately transferred to a desk job at a remote supply base in the Arctic, a place where his opportunities for proud displays of authority would be very limited. Before he left, Colonel Richardson made it required for him to attend a one-on-one history lesson with the base historian, focusing on the Santo raid and the beginnings of Air Force Special Warfare. Furthermore, the colonel started a new base-wide program called Valor Among Us, designed to identify and honor the surprisingly large number of veterans working in civilian contract positions on the base. Their stories, once hidden, were now shared in the base newspaper and at commander meetings, a constant reminder of the quiet skill and hidden heroism that surrounded the active duty personnel every day. About a month later, a humbled and much quieter ex-officer was in a local grocery store picking out a carton of milk when he saw a familiar figure in the next aisle. It was Henry Walker, calmly comparing two brands of canned soup. For a moment, Harris considered turning and walking away, but the old man's words about humility echoed in his mind. He walked over, his heart pounding. "Mr. Walker," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Henry looked up, his expression unreadable. I wanted to apologize for my behavior. There's no excuse for it." Henry studied the young man's face for a long moment, then simply nodded. "Apology accepted, son," he said before turning his attention back to the soup. "Just remember the lesson." The forgiveness, offered so simply, was both a release and a lifelong burden for the young man to carry. Henry went home, his act of quiet grace unseen by anyone else. A final private lesson from a man who was a hero, not because of the medal he wore, but because of the man he was. Thank you for joining us for this story on veteran valor. If you were moved by the quiet heroism of Henry Walker, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of the simple heroes who walk among us.